You're watching the Creator Channel. Please like the video and subscribe. The throne room of the Red Keep had stopped being a room and started being a wound that happened to have walls. Daylight leaked through the broken roof beams in pale sheets, cutting through drifting ash that never fully settled, and the floor stones were slick, where soot had mixed with rainwater and old blood, into a thin black glaze. The Iron Throne was still there, but it wasn't a seat anymore. It was a half-melted ruin of twisted blades, warped into a cruel sculpture that caught the light like it wanted to hurt someone. At the far end, where kings once received petitions with silk banners and choir voices, Daenerys Targaryen stood on a raised platform built from salvaged timber and marble chunks, not because she needed height to be seen, but because height is what power looks like when the building around it is collapsing. Grey Worm held position to her right, rigid as a spear, his face unreadable in a way that made the room colder. Tyrion Lannister stood off to the side again, closer to a broken pillar than to her, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes tracking every movement like the room was a trap he'd stepped into on purpose. Around them, 5,000 to 6,000 Unsullied weren't all in the hall at once, but their presence filled it anyway. 200 at the inner doors and gallery steps, 100 lining the shattered colonnade, another 200 in the courtyard beyond, and rotating squads posted on every approach to the hill, so no one entered this place without being measured first. Their spears were upright, their shields clean, their boots leaving neat prints in ash that looked almost insulting against the ruin. They'd meant to hold court, that was how it was described, to the city, how it was sold to the surviving lords, and the fearful small folk alike. The Queen would hear petitions, the Queen would set rules, the Queen would restore order. But a burned capital doesn't bring petitions first. It brings accusations. It brings names. It brings people dragged in with rope marks on wrists and ash on their faces, blinking against the light like they'd been pulled out of the earth. The benches that had once seated high-born courtiers were replaced by rough planks. Scribes sat with ink and parchment on their knees, recording what was said because written judgment lasts longer than shouted judgment. A translator stood near the front, a thin man with terrified eyes who had survived by being useful to whoever held the hill that week. Above the platform, where the roof was gone entirely, Drogon perched on a blackened beam like a living shadow, wings folded tight, head angled down toward the hall, his breath slow and heavy. When he shifted, ash slid from the beam in a soft cascade, and every prisoner flinched in the same direction without meaning to. The first group brought forward were not lords. They were the men the city would recognize, former gold cloaks with their cloaks gone, dock bosses with hands still stained from rope tar, a baker's apprentice with a cracked lip and a look that said he hadn't slept in days. Their knees hit stone when Unsullied shoved them down in a line. Grey Worm's voice came flat and precise, translated into the common tongue with a fraction of delay that made every sentence feel like it was being weighed twice. These men stole from the food stores. The translation came. These men attacked soldiers at night. These men hid weapons under rubble. The dock boss tried to speak fast, saying the stores were already being taken, saying his children were hungry, saying he wasn't a killer, only desperate. The translator repeated it, voice shaking. Daenerys listened without moving, her hair pinned back, her clothing darkened by soot at the hem where it had brushed stone, a simple crown-like band at her head that looked less like jewelry and more like a reminder that she was not just a woman in a burned hall. "Hungry," she said finally, and the word carried in the ruined acoustics like a bell struck once. "Everyone is hungry. Hunger does not make you innocent." One of the former gold cloaks, older with a scar running down his forearm, raised his head and said, "Your soldiers take two," and it was the most dangerous thing anyone had said in that room, because it wasn't a plea, it was an accusation. Grey Worm's gaze snapped to him, and several spear points dipped a fraction. Tyrion's eyes tightened, not in anger, in calculation, like he was watching a match land too close to spilled oil. Daenerys didn't shout. "Do they?" she asked Grey Worm, and the question was quieter than the accusation, which made it worse for everyone listening. Grey Worm answered in his own tongue first, clipped, then the translator forced it into words the hall could understand. Unsullied do not steal. The dock boss laughed once, sharp and stupid, then caught himself when Drogon's head lowered slightly. Daenerys stepped down from the platform one step, close enough that the prisoners could see the soot shadow under her eyes, the strain of someone trying to turn ashes into law. "If one of my men takes what is not given," she said, voice steady, "he will answer here the same as you." The former gold cloak spat blood onto the stone, either from fear or defiance, and muttered something about queens and fire. Grey Worm took a half-step forward like a reflex, and Tyrion shifted his weight subtly, like he wanted to speak, and was deciding whether words would help, or only add fuel. The tribunal moved anyway, because a tribunal has momentum once it begins. Witnesses were brought, thin women with soot in their hair, boys with grime under their fingernails, an old septon whose hands shook so badly he had to clasp them together to stop them rattling. They spoke of night knives and secret meetings, of men who called themselves protectors of the city, and then used protection as cover to rob. One boy, voice cracking, pointed at the dock boss and said, "He paid them," and the dock boss roared liar until an Unsullied slammed a shield into his shoulder and forced him back down. Daenerys watched the boy's face, then the dock boss's, then asked a question that didn't sound like a trap, but was, "Who did you pay?" The dock boss hesitated half a heartbeat too long. He looked left as if the answer might be standing in the shadows. "No one," he said. "I didn't pay no one." Daenerys's gaze went past him to the former gold cloak. "And you?" she asked. The gold cloak's jaw worked, and he said, "We did what we had to," and the translation of that landed in the hall like a confession without details. Grey Worm's patience was visible as stillness. Tyrion's patience was visible as restraint, the way he didn't interrupt even when he clearly wanted to. Then they brought in a man who looked like the burned city itself, thick-armed, beard stained with soot, wrists raw from rope, eyes hard and exhausted. He didn't kneel fast enough, so an Unsullied forced him down with a boot. He didn't cry out. The translator announced his name as if names still mattered in a city where half the dead went uncounted. "Hob," the man said when asked, and you could hear the lie in it. No mother names a child Hob. But you could also hear the strategy. Real names are anchors someone can drown you with. Grey Worm accused him of organizing ambushes on patrols and attacking supply carts. The scribe's quills scratched. Daenerys looked at him and said, "You call yourself a protector of this city?" Hob lifted his head just enough to meet her eyes without pretending he was equal. "I protect what's left of it," he said, voice rough. "You protect your hill." The translator repeated it, and for a moment the hall held its breath, because that line was the kind that starts rebellions if it survives the room. Grey Worm's hand tightened on his spear shaft. Tyrion's mouth opened a fraction, then closed, like he'd chosen to watch instead of speak. Daenerys didn't react like a woman insulted. She reacted like a ruler deciding what precedent she wanted. "My hill," she repeated, then took another step down, the soot-stained hem of her clothing brushing stone. "This was a hill of kings who starved their people and called it order," she said. "I burned the city's chains. I did not burn it so that men like you could put new chains on the hungry." Hobbs' laugh came out hoarse. "Chains?" he said. "Tell that to the men you execute in the street to teach us obedience." The translator's voice faltered on the word execute. Grey Worm spoke sharply, and the translator recovered, repeating it with forced steadiness. Daenerys's face didn't soften, but something in her eyes sharpened into focus, like she'd found the real argument beneath the rubble. "You attacked my soldiers," she said. "You killed them." Hobbs' reply was immediate. "They were killing us," he said. "Slow, with rules, with hunger, with fear." He glanced up at Drogon without meaning to, then back at her. "You call it peace when your spear points tell us when to breathe." Tyrion stepped forward then, not dramatically, just enough that his voice could reach the platform without shouting. "Your Grace," he said, careful, using the title that kept him alive. "If this becomes only punishment, It becomes fuel. The city is ash. Ash catches. Grey Worm turned his head toward Tyrion like a blade turning toward a throat. Daenerys' gaze shifted to Tyrion, and in that look was the memory of him standing in the same hall when it still had a roof, of promises made in the language of necessity. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked. Tyrion didn't perform wisdom. He spoke like a man who'd lived among starving crowds and knew what made them turn. "Make the law visible," he said. "Not only the spear. Put food distribution under written rule. Assign watchers from the city, men and women who have something to lose if the stores are stolen. If an Unsullied steals, punish him publicly. If a city man steals, punish him publicly. And if these men," he nodded toward Hobb and the others, "can be used, use them. Forced labor rebuilding walls, clearing streets, carrying stone. Let them pay back what they broke instead of dying and becoming martyrs." Grey Worm's answer came hard. "They will kill again." The translator repeated it. Tyrion didn't flinch. "Some will," he said. "Some will die rebuilding, some will run. But if everyone who hates you dies, the city will be quieter for a week and then louder forever." Drogon shifted again above them, claws scraping charred wood, and the sound made the prisoners shrink into themselves, as if the dragon was the only judge that mattered. Daenerys' decision came in pieces, which was worse than a quick execution because it felt like policy being born. "The dock boss," she said, pointing without ceremony, "stole from the stores and paid men to guard his theft. He will hang at the fishmonger square at dawn. Let the city see what theft costs when people are starving." The dock boss started to shout, then choked on his own words as two Unsullied hauled him back. Daenerys didn't watch him leave. "The former gold cloaks," she continued, "are stripped of any claim to law. They will work. They will clear the Blackwater steps and rebuild the Mudgate wall where it's broken. If they run, they die. If they sabotage, they die." She paused, eyes on Hobb. "And you," she said, and the hall leaned in, because everyone wanted to know whether defiance earned death or something stranger. "You will not hang," she decided. Hobb's expression flickered, not relief, suspicion. "You will lead a work crew under Unsullied guard," she said. "You will clear the streets of bodies and rubble. You will open lanes so food can move. If you do that, you live. If you use that position to move knives, I will not hunt you. I will burn the blocks that hide you until the city itself gives you up." The threat wasn't loud. It was intimate and absolute. And it landed harder than shouting because it described exactly how dragons solve problems when patience ends. Grey Worm did not look pleased. Tyrion did not look victorious. Neither mattered in that moment as much as the effect on the room. The tribunal wasn't just punishing, it was defining a new reality, that the Queen would decide who died, who worked, who ate, and who was allowed to claim righteousness in a city that had run out of it. The scribes wrote faster. The translator's hands shook so badly he had to clasp them between sentences. Outside, in the courtyard, the sound of civilians gathering grew, a low murmur like surf, because word travels faster than ravens when executions are promised. When the next cases came, they were higher up the ladder, and uglier in their implications. A merchant factor was dragged in, accusing a rival guild of hiding grain. A half-burned septon accused soldiers of taking daughters in the night and called it justice for Ash. A battered Riverlands knight claimed he'd been ordered by a lord to bring food to the Red Keep, and had been robbed by city patriots on the way. Each case exposed how the burned city was already becoming a market. Fear sold for coin, protection sold for food, truth sold for survival. Daenerys listened, asked a few sharp questions, issued a few swift punishments, and every time she did it, the Dragon's Court became less like a throne and more like a machine, one that could make order and could also grind people into examples. Hobb watched all of it from his knees, and in his eyes was the knowledge that rebuilding under Spearpoint was still captivity. Tyrion watched all of it, and looked like a man recognizing the shape of a future he couldn't fully steer. Grey Worm watched all of it, and looked like a man who would prefer simple enemies and clean solutions because tribunals are slow and soldiers hate slow. By the time dusk bled into the shattered hall, Drogon lifted his head and let out one long low sound that wasn't a roar and wasn't quiet either, a vibration that made ash dance on the floor stones. The tribunal paused, everyone instinctively looking up as if the dragon was voting on the day's judgments. Daenerys looked up too, not afraid, just acknowledging the reality that her authority had two faces, parchment and flame. When she spoke again, it wasn't to the prisoners. It was to the room, to the scribes, to the guards, to the idea of the realm listening through rumors. "This city will be rebuilt," she said. Not as it was, as it must be. In the burned silence that followed, the tribunal's meaning became clear to anyone with sense. The Queen wasn't only judging the guilty, she was training the living to accept a new kind of rule. And in King's Landing, acceptance never comes clean. It comes with knives hidden under ash, with whispered alliances formed in alleys, with people deciding whether the dragon's justice is protection or occupation. Blackwater Bay looked wrong with order returning to it, like a scar that had been scrubbed clean but still hurt when the wind hit. The docks below the burned hill were half rebuilt, new pine pilings driven into the mud, fresh planks laid in clean runs, rope lines hung straight as if straight rope could make the city forget what fire did. The water itself carried flakes of soot that never fully left, and when the tide went out it exposed blackened stone steps where bodies had once been dragged. Warships loomed over the new piers in tight formation, not a grand fleet but enough hull and canvas to say control, a mix of captured cogs, refitted galleys, and a few sleek foreign-built ships pressed into service, their decks crowded with disciplined men. Unsullied patrols watched the dock roads in rotating squares, pairs at the warehouse mouths, a squad at each pierhead. A larger block near the customs house ruin, where the city's old paperwork had burned and left power to whoever could write new rules. When the Braavosi vessels entered the river mouth, they didn't come like raiders. They came like an invoice. 3 narrow-bellied galleys with high prows and clean lines slid into the bay with practiced calm, sails furled with precision, oars dipping in unison, their hulls painted dark and maintained too well for a realm that smelled like ash. Behind them came 2 heavier cogs riding lower in the water, cargo ships, not carrying an army, but carrying the things that make an army possible. Barrels, crates, bolt bundles, spare rope, and sealed chests that clinked softly when the deck shifted. Dockworkers stopped what they were doing and stared because men can sense the difference between a ship that brings trade and a ship that brings terms. The Braavosi envoy stepped onto the pier as if he'd already been here, boots clean despite the mud, cloak cut fine but practical, the seal of his house or institution not shouted in embroidery, just present in small details that mattered to the right eyes. His guards came behind him in matching quiet armor, breastplates polished, helmets shaped sleek, short swords at the hip and long slim shields carried in a way that suggested training, not bravado. There were 40 of them on the pier in the first wave, another 60 staying with the ships, and dockside watchers counted them anyway because Westeros had begun counting everything that might become a threat. The envoy carried no spear. He carried a leather case bound with straps, fat with paper, and a second smaller tube sealed in wax that looked like it could survive fire. He spoke to the dockmaster first, through a translator, because even when Braavosi speak the common tongue they prefer the advantage of delay, and then he requested the Queen's representative with the kind of polite firmness that makes refusal feel childish. When Grey Worm's men arrived to escort him up toward the hill's shadow, the Braavosi didn't show fear. He only looked at the spears with a professional interest, like he had seen spears before and knew exactly how much they cost to feed. In the ruined hall where power tried to wear a crown again, the meeting looked less like court and more like a counting room dressed up in banners. The ceiling was still broken in places, daylight cutting in harsh angles, ash dusting the stone like a permanent stain. Daenerys stood at the front with Grey Worm near her right shoulder, rigid and silent, and Tyrion slightly off to one side the way he had been lately, close enough to be useful, far enough to be blamed. A cluster of scribes waited with ink and parchment, because decisions were becoming records now, not just spoken threats. The Braavosi envoy bowed with exactness and did not kneel. He introduced himself by name and office, then opened his leather case and laid out documents in a neat spread, as if the burned throne room were a desk. He didn't begin by insulting her. He began by reminding her she lived in a world that remembers numbers longer than it remembers righteousness. "The Iron Bank does not forget," the translator said for him, voice careful. "The Iron Bank does not forgive, only settle." He tapped the first page with a gloved finger. "Crown debts," the translator continued, "accrued interest, default clauses." The words hung in the hall like chain links being tested. Tyrion watched the pages the way a man watches a blade edge. He didn't need to read every line to understand the shape, repayment terms that didn't care who sat the throne, penalties that didn't care who won wars, and an implied truth that made Grey Worm's jaw set in quiet anger. Coin can move faster than armies. The envoy spoke again, and the translator's voice became the weapon. "You have taken a city," he said. "You have taken a throne." He paused, letting the room feel the difference between taking a seat and paying for it. But crowns have never been free. Daenerys's face stayed controlled, but her eyes sharpened. "We did not borrow from you," she said, and the simplicity of it made the hall feel smaller. The Braavosi replied without heat. "The realm borrowed, the translator delivered. The realm is not a man, the realm is a land. The land remains." He let that settle, then pointed toward the windows where the Blackwater could be glimpsed beyond smoke haze. "We have not marched an army," he said, and the line was almost gentle. Then he added the part that turned gentle into threat without raising a voice. "We have brought ships enough to make questions real." He did not say blockade. He didn't need to. The two heavy cogs down at the pier said it: provisions, bolts, spare rigging, the quiet ability to sit on a waterway and squeeze a city that already lived on ration math. Grey Worm spoke sharply, words clipped, and the translator hesitated a fraction before carrying it over. The meaning was plain. This was a conquered city, not a market stall, and threats would be answered with steel. The envoy didn't flinch. "Steel kills men," he answered in Braavosi first, then through the translator in common. "Coin hires more." He opened another document, this one shorter, cleaner, written like certainty. 10,000 sellswords can be raised in weeks, he said, and the hall understood immediately what he was really offering: obedience now, or a wider war later that wouldn't look like banners clashing at a field, but like ports closing, mercenaries landing, and food failing to arrive. Tyrion's mind moved ahead of the words. He could already see the pressure points, the Reach's grain choking, the Stormland's coast taxes, Dawn's sea lanes, the Iron Islands splitting into predators and contractors. If Braavos decided to turn the river mouth into a financial choke, the war stopped being houses. It became continents, with contracts instead of crowns. Daenerys didn't shout. She leaned slightly forward, hand resting on the warped throne's melted steel as if she was grounding herself in the ruin she'd created. "And what does the Iron Bank want?" she asked. The envoy answered like a man reciting weather. "Acknowledgement," he said. "A repayment structure." He slid forward a page that listed collateral categories without calling them that: harbour customs, toll income, a percentage of certain exports, a claim on future tribute. He didn't say you will pay with your people's hunger. He let the numbers imply it. Tyrion stepped in before the room became only spears and pride. "There are other ways," he said softly, and his voice was the only one in that hall that could speak about debt without sounding like surrender. Trade concessions, harbour priority, a structured schedule that doesn't starve the city while it rebuilds. The envoy looked at Tyrion like he'd been expecting him all along. "A schedule requires trust," he replied. "Trust requires enforcement." His eyes flicked toward Grey Worm's men, then back to Tyrion. "And enforcement," he added, "is expensive." That was the moment the Iron Bank's knock on Ash turned from foreign pressure into internal poison, because everyone in the hall understood the same thing at once. If repayment required enforcement, then someone in Westeros would offer to be the enforcer for a price, and that someone would become powerful. Tyrion felt it like a cold coin placed in his palm. He could almost hear the names being whispered in other rooms already. Who in the Riverlands controlled crossings? Who in the Reach controlled grain? Who in the Westerlands controlled gold road tolls? And who, quiet, alive when he shouldn't be, had always been best at turning debts into leashes? Far from the burned city, Harrenhal's scaffolds creaked under the weight of men making something enormous pretend it could be whole. The towers were still monstrous silhouettes, black stone broken in places like snapped teeth, but new timber frameworks hugged the walls where masons worked, hauling blocks, setting mortar, hammering iron spikes into ancient cracks. Hundreds of laborers moved in lines that looked like an army from a distance, 800 on daylight shifts, another 200 rotating through night work under torchlight. Because rebuilding a fort big was not craft, it was logistics. Peter Baelish walked a plank platform laid across a courtyard ruin, boots dusty, cloak dark and plain, a leather glove on one hand because rough timber bites, and he held a folded ledger instead of a sword. His guards were not many, 50 visible in the yard, another 100 placed up in half-repaired galleries and along choke points, enough to keep thieves out and to keep the workers nervous about striking. A Riverlord's steward stood beside him with a wax tablet, listing costs, stone shipments, timber theft, wage demands, the price of iron rising because everyone wanted iron now. Baelish listened, nodded once and said, "Pay the good masons first. The bad ones will still show up hungry." He didn't dress it up. He wasn't performing charm. He was doing what he always did, building leverage out of necessity. A rider arrived through the gatehouse with mud up to the knees of his horse, and a sealed note tucked inside his sleeve. Not a raven. A hand-carried message, the kind used when you don't trust skies. Baelish broke the seal with a thumbnail and read without smiling. The words were short, the meaning large, Bravosi ships on the Blackwater, documents out on tables, repayment being spoken in a burned hall. The rider waited, breathing hard, eyes scanning the yard like he was expecting an arrow. Baelish handed the note to his own scribe, quiet boy, ink-stained fingers, and said, "Copy it, burn the original." The scribe blinked, then did as told, because in Harrenhal you learn quickly that paper can be more dangerous than steel. Another visitor waited under a canvas awning near the half-repaired Great Hall, flanked by 2 men in foreign-cut cloaks with tidy beards and clean boots that didn't belong in Riverland's mud. Bravosi, or close enough to make locals call them Bravosi. One opened a small leather pouch and let a stack of coins sit visible for a moment, heavy, honest metal, then closed it again. "We hear you are rebuilding," the foreigner said, common tongue accented but clear, the voice of a man used to being listened to. Baelish didn't deny it. He glanced at the scaffolds, the workers, the timber stacks like he was checking inventory, and replied, "People rebuild when they're afraid of what happens if they don't." The foreigner's smile was thin. "Fear is a market," he said. Peter's eyes returned to him calm. "So is hunger," he answered. This was how the Iron Bank's knock travelled inland, without ever moving its ships, through need, through repair, through the quiet places where men wanted money but didn't want to be seen begging for it. The foreigner didn't say credit first. He said stability. He said security. He said collateral without saying the word, pointing instead to things the Riverlands still had that could be monetized. Ferry crossings, road tolls, grain storage, stone quarries, the right to station guards on bridges for safety. Baelish listened like he was taking measurements. He didn't promise he could deliver the realm. He promised smaller things. Access, introductions, timetables, a way to turn a shattered region into something lenders could understand. "If you want repayment," Baelish said, tone mild, "you don't only need a queen, you need the roads." He nodded toward the god's eye's direction, toward crossings and choke points and the long artery of the realm. And roads, he added, are run by men who want coin and can be persuaded to call it duty. The foreigner studied him. Some will say you are brokering chains, he said. Baelish's answer was simple, almost bored. Some will say anything, he replied. What matters is whether the carts move. He looked down at his ledger, then at the scaffolds again. Harrenhal will be standing, he said, not like a prophecy, like a construction schedule, and when it stands people will come here to ask for safety. He paused, then let the real hook show without dressing it up. Safety always costs. Back in the burned capital, the Braavosi envoy gathered his papers with the same calm he'd arrived with, because the meeting didn't need to end in agreement to be effective. The act of laying shackling documents onto ash-stained stone had already done its work. As he was escorted out, dockside messengers ran with whispers. Braavos is here, the debt is alive, the sea can be closed, sell swords can be bought, and the war is changing shape. Daenerys remained standing in the ruined hall, still framed by broken beams and melted steel, still backed by disciplined spears, and yet the pressure in the room had shifted from who rules to who can pay. Tyrion watched the envoy go and understood the new danger, with a clarity that tasted like iron. You can burn an enemy's throne, but you can't burn a contract that lives in a bank across the sea. And in Harrenhal, where hammers kept ringing and men kept hauling stone until their names stopped mattering, Baelish turned a page in his ledger and made a small note in the margin. Just a few lines, nothing dramatic, marking who would soon be desperate enough to borrow, and who would soon be desperate enough to lend. The realm had always believed wars were won with swords. Now the ash was teaching it a harsher lesson. Wars can be won with ledgers, and ledgers travel farther than armies. After the Braavosi ships came in, King's Landing felt smaller, as if the city understood what a ledger could do to a burned throat. The rebuilt stretches of the Blackwater docks creaked under fresh timber and old fear, and the bay held those sleek foreign hulls like a reminder that the sea doesn't belong to crowns, it belongs to whoever can afford to close it. Up on Aegon's high hill, the Red Keep's broken bones still caught the wind. Missing roof beams, soot-streaked columns, half-collapsed galleries where ravens perched and watched like they were waiting for the next body. Unsullied discipline kept the hill from falling into chaos. Squads rotated through the inner approaches in neat blocks. Pairs at the stair mouths, a line at each arch, a heavier knot at the shattered throne room entrance, boots making the same measured sound on ash-dusted stone every hour on the hour. Grey Worm had doubled the patrol density since the dock ambushes and the tribunal, not because he was afraid of blades, but because he understood what disorder does to a garrison that's holding a city that hates it. Even the torches were placed like a strategy, spaced to deny shadow, angled to light alley mouths, replaced on schedule, yet the city still produced darkness anyway, the kind that slips under doors and into men's thoughts. Daenerys Targaryen walked alone in the part of the Red Keep that had survived by being thick-walled and hidden, a private corridor where the stone held the day's warmth, and the air still smelled faintly of smoke that would never fully leave. She wore dark travel wool beneath a heavier cloak, a crown band set aside for once, her hair braided back tight, practical, the way Missandei had once braided it when they had time to look like rulers instead of survivors. That thought came uninvited and stayed. Missandei's absence wasn't a single wound, it was a missing sound in every room, no soft correction, no quiet reminder, no steady eyes when the shouting started. Daenerys could still see it too clearly when she closed her eyes, a woman in chains, salt wind, cruel words, a death chosen to make a queen react in front of an army. The reaction had come later, and it had been enormous and unforgiving, and now Daenerys lived inside the echo of it. The city kept offering her the same reflection, ash, accusation, and men who spoke of justice, with knives hidden under their sleeves. Then the Iron Bank had arrived, and laid paper onto soot, like paper was stronger than fire. She had held her posture through it, had kept her voice measured, but inside she'd felt the ground shift again. Another force, not banners, not dragons, but the simple fact that creditors don't care what you believe, only what you can pay. Grey Worm waited at the end of the corridor with 10 unsullied, helmets on, spears upright, faces unreadable, because even a queen in her own keep didn't get to move unguarded anymore. He watched her approach without moving, only his eyes tracking her in that controlled way that made even allies feel inspected. "He is here," he said, the words clipped in his tongue first, then translated by a frightened clerk who had been stationed nearby to make sure the Queen's orders could be understood by the men who would die carrying them out. Daenerys nodded once. She didn't ask if it was safe. Nothing in this city was safe. "No one else," she said, and Grey Worm understood the meaning. No listeners, no witnesses who would turn private counsel into a public weapon. He gave a small hand signal, and 2 unsullied peeled off to stand at the far stairwell while the others held the corridor, creating a living seal. The clerk retreated to the edge of torchlight, eyes down. The chamber she'd chosen wasn't grand. It had once been a solar for a lesser lord. Thick table, narrow window, a faded tapestry half burned at one corner, now repurposed because the great rooms felt too exposed. A brazier burned low in the corner, more for light than warmth. The air held the scent of hot iron and old wood. Jon Snow stood near the table, cloak black, the fur at his collar dusted with ash like the city had tried to claim him too. He looked thinner than he had in the war, not starved, but tightened by the kind of stress that doesn't show on the belly, only around the eyes. His hair had grown out enough to curl at the ends under his hood. His sword wasn't drawn, but it was there, kept close in the way a man keeps a truth that people won't stop asking about. 2 Northmen stood behind him, quiet as stones, leather and mail under dark cloaks, hands relaxed near their belts, eyes on the door the way men watch a tree line. Jon turned as she entered, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke because both of them felt the weight of what had happened since they last stood alone together, without armies around them. Daenerys closed the door herself, not trusting the act to anyone else. "You came," she said, and her voice didn't soften the way she might have wanted it to. Jon's answer was plain. "You sent," he said, and it wasn't defiance, it was reality. She was queen here, and he was the man who had learned that refusing a summons in King's Landing gets people killed. Daenerys stepped toward the table and rested her gloved hand on its edge, steadying herself in a way she would never admit was needed. "They came today with paper," she said, "not swords." Jon's eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicion, focus. "The Bravosi," he said, and the fact that he named them told her he was listening to more than northern rumors. "They say the realm owes them," Daenerys replied. "They speak as if the realm is a thing that survives whatever I burn." She held his gaze. "They speak as if my rule is a temporary inconvenience." Jon's mouth tightened. Not a dramatic reaction, just the look of a man understanding that a new kind of enemy had entered the room. "Coin doesn't kneel," he said quietly. "It only waits." She let that sit, then said the thing she had not said aloud to anyone since the day the city became ash beneath dragon wings. "I think I turned them against me," she admitted, and the words came out controlled but sharp at the edges, like admitting it cost her blood. Jon didn't rush to comfort her. He didn't offer a pretty lie. That was why she had asked for him, and she knew it. "Some were against you before you arrived," he said. "Some were against you because they were afraid. And some—" he paused, careful. "Some watched what happened and decided fear was safer than hope." Daenerys' eyes flicked downward for a moment, then back up. "Miss Sandy," she said, not as explanation as confession. The name made the air heavier. "They killed her to make me break," she continued, voice low, and for the first time there was a tremor under the steadiness. "They wanted me to be the monster they already called me." Her fingers tightened on the table edge until leather creaked. "I gave them what they wanted." Jon's expression shifted, not pity, something closer to grief mixed with recognition. "You loved her," he said simply. Daenerys' throat worked once, and she didn't look away. She was my measure, she said. When the rooms lied, she did not. When the men praised, she did not. When I was furious, she stayed steady. She exhaled, slow. Now I hear only soldiers and scribes and enemies. John glanced toward the brazier, then back to her. And Tyrion, he said, and there was no insult in it, only an acknowledgement that counsel in this place always had knives hidden under it. Daenerys didn't answer that directly. Tyrion is trying to keep the city from choking, she said. Grey Worm is trying to keep it from bleeding. Her mouth tightened. The Iron Bank is trying to make it pay. Then she looked at John with a frankness that was almost ugly, because ugly truth had become the only kind worth anything. And you, she said, they listen to you, even when they say they don't. John held her gaze, and you could see him choosing his words the way he'd once chosen where to put men on a wall in a storm. If you want them to stop turning, he said, you have to show them where the line is, not the line of fear, the line of rule. Daenerys' eyes sharpened. Rule, she echoed. They call it occupation. John didn't flinch. Then make the difference visible, he said. Food moves without bribes. Patrols punish their own if they take. Trials don't become revenge. And you, he paused, then said it anyway, you stop letting your anger choose the hour. The sentence landed hard because it was true, and because it wasn't spoken like a man trying to dominate her, it was spoken like a man trying to keep her alive politically. Daenerys stared at him, and for a moment the queen slipped, and the exhausted woman showed through. I don't know how to make them believe me again, she said, almost to herself. John's answer was quiet and practical. You won't, all at once, he said. Belief returns like a road being rebuilt, stone by stone, and thieves trying to steal the stone. She stepped away from the table and moved toward the narrow window slit, looking down into the ruined city where torchlight marked patrol routes like veins. Far off, the Blackwater docks glimmered with new wood and foreign sails. They told me today, she said without turning, that they could raise 10,000 men faster than I could raise 1,000. John's voice came behind her. That's how they fight, he said, not with banners, with shortages. Daenerys turned back. And if I refuse, she asked. John answered honestly. They will make the realm pay anyway, he said. They will choke ports. They will fund your enemies. They will buy men who call themselves saviors. Daenerys' eyes narrowed, not at him, at the situation. So I bend, she said. I pay. John shook his head once. You negotiate, he said. You don't kneel, and you don't pretend you can burn a bank across the sea. You make terms that keep the city alive while it rebuilds, and you make sure the lords who would profit from chaos don't become the ones writing those terms for you. The implication was clear, and it slid naturally into the next danger. Daenerys' voice lowered. There are men who understand debts, she said, who understand doors. John's eyes held steady, and he didn't ask names, because names are hooks. Then don't let them be the only ones, he replied. If the war is turning into coin and roads, put honest men on roads. Put hard men on roads, and keep the ones who smile too easily where you can see them. She stood very still, then spoke the real reason she'd called him. I need the North to stop being a wound behind me, she said. I need it to be steady. John's face didn't change much, but the air did. This was the knife edge, North and South, pride and survival, the realm deciding what it would become. Daenerys didn't dress it up. I think I made a mistake, she said. I demanded too much, too soon. John watched her, and he could tell she wasn't performing humility, she was making a strategic move born from pain and pressure. What are you asking? He said. Daenerys crossed back to the table and placed both hands on it, leaning in slightly. Not looming, not pleading, just speaking like a ruler choosing to spend something valuable. I will let you go, she said, not as exile, not as punishment, as duty. John's eyes flickered, quick. Go, he repeated. North, she said, resume your place, the wall, Winterfell, whatever you decide is needed. She held his gaze. I will not place unsullied garrisons in the north. I will not demand northern hostages. I will not call banners there in my name. The words were deliberate, each one a nail hammered into a new policy. The north keeps its watch, keeps its frontier, keeps its laws. You keep the peace there, and you keep the free folk from becoming another army someone can buy." Jon's jaw worked once, not tightening, weighing. "And in return?" he asked, because every offer in King's Landing has a hook. Daenerys didn't smile. "In return," she said, "you do not become a banner for men who want me gone. You do not let the North become the excuse the South uses to fracture faster." She paused, then added the private truth that made the offer feel real. "And you send me counsel when I ask for it. Honest counsel. Not flattery, not fear." Jon studied her, and for a moment you could see the man who'd sworn oaths too many times in too many cold places, trying to decide which oath would save more lives. "If I go," he said slowly, "they will talk." Daenerys' eyes didn't blink. "They already talk," she replied. "Let them talk about a queen who released the North instead of chaining it." Her voice dipped. "I need the realm to see that I can let go of something powerful without burning it." The sentence carried Missandei inside it without naming her again. The door opened then, not thrown wide, not careless, just a controlled entry, as if whoever came in understood that this room was a blade edge. Tyrion Lannister stepped inside with a single unsullied behind him, cloak dark, face drawn, eyes moving quickly as he took in Jon, the Northman, Daenerys' posture. He looked like a man who had slept little and read too much. "Your Grace," he said, careful, and then, to Jon, Lord Snow. Jon's expression stayed guarded. Tyrion's gaze lingered on Daenerys a moment longer, searching her face for the temperature of her mood, the way men in courts learn to do to survive. "The Braavosi envoy requests a written answer by dawn," Tyrion said. "They're polite about it. That's how you know it matters." Daenerys didn't turn her head. "They will have a written answer," she said, then looked back to Jon. "You will have a written answer too." Tyrion's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise, then understanding. He didn't interrupt with a speech. He stepped closer to the table and said, "Lo, if you grant the North this, it changes the room." Daenerys' eyes stayed on Jon. "That is the point," she replied. Tyrion exhaled through his nose, not amusement, acknowledgement of a hard choice. "Then we do it cleanly," he said. "A public order with private safeguards, a letter to the Northern Lords, a clear line that this is duty, not exile." He glanced at Jon. "And a route out that doesn't get you murdered by the city on the way to the gate." Jon's mouth twitched slightly at the practicality. "I can get out," Jon said. Tyrion didn't argue. "You can," he agreed, "but you shouldn't have to fight your way through your own allies to do it." He turned to Daenerys. "Grey Worm will want a strong escort," he said. "The guerrillas will see any movement as an opportunity, and if the Iron Bank is already measuring leverage, they'll measure this too." Daenerys nodded once, then spoke like a ruler finishing a decision so it could not be unmade by nerves. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will issue the writ. Jon Snow is released to the North to resume its defense and governance. The North's internal rule remains its own." She looked at Tyrion. "You will draft it. No flourishes, no insults, no hidden hooks." Tyrion bowed his head slightly. "As you command," he said, and there was relief in his eyes, not because he loved politics, but because a clear decision is better than a drifting crisis. Daenerys looked to Jon again. "And you," she said, "you leave the day after. With enough men to get you safely past the city's teeth, not enough to look like an army." Jon gave a single nod. "I'll take 20, he said, "and ride hard." Daenerys accepted the number. "Grey Worm will give you 50 unsullied as far as the King's Road's safe reach," she said. Grey Worm wasn't in the room, but the policy was already moving through the keep like a new order of battle. Jon's eyes narrowed slightly at the idea of unsullied escorting him north. Daenerys anticipated the discomfort and answered it before he spoke. "Not to watch you," she said. "To prevent someone else from turning your departure into a message written in blood." When Jon finally moved toward the door, the chamber felt colder for it. He paused once, hand on the latch, and looked back at Daenerys in a way that wasn't romantic and wasn't hostile, just two people who had survived too much trying to decide whether survival could become something steadier. "You can't undo what's done," he said, "but you can show them what you do next." Daenerys held his gaze. "That is why I called you," she replied. Jon nodded once and left, Northmen following, boot soft on stone. Tyrion waited until the door shut, then looked at Daenerys with the tired bluntness of a man who has watched history chew through good intentions. "This will anger people," he said. Daenerys' voice stayed calm. "Let it," she answered. "I am done feeding anger with fear." Tyrion's eyes flicked toward the window slit where the bay's foreign ships sat like patient threats. "Then we have to feed them with structure," he said. "Food, law, and a repayment plan that doesn't hand the realm's throat to bravos." Daenerys' jaw didn't clench. Her whole face simply settled into that controlled hardness that meant she was listening and also preparing to act. "Draft the terms," she said, "and start finding out who in this city is selling hunger for coin." Tyrion inclined his head, then hesitated as if weighing whether to say something personal. "Missandei would have wanted you to rest," he said quietly, and the name landed like a bruise touched gently. Daenerys didn't respond with softness. She responded with truth. She would have wanted the realm to live, she said. So we moved. By dawn, ravens went north with wax still warm, and a second set went south and east with the Queen's answer to bravos wrapped in careful language that did not kneel, but did not pretend the sea could be ignored. In the streets below, the burned city's guerrillas listened for shifts, new patrol patterns, new work crews, new rules, and debated whether the Queen's tribunal was tightening into tyranny or bending toward order. On the docks, Braavosi guards remained polite and ready, their ships stocked enough to make the implied blockade more than rumor. Farther away, the realm's fractures kept widening on their own schedules, the reach bleeding at choke points where grain and pride collided, the Iron Islands dividing their sails between raiders and escorts, Dawn watching lanes and waiting to make the sea expensive, and in the Riverlands, the big black silhouette of Harrenhal rising behind scaffolds while men with ledgers and men with knives both began to understand the same new truth. The war was moving from banners to bottlenecks, from kings to contracts, from houses to systems. And on the King's Road, very soon, ash would give way to snow, as Jon rode north with fewer men than a lord would call an escort, and more purpose than an exile would carry, leaving the capital behind so it could become what it was becoming, a battleground not just of steel and fire, but of debt, food, ports, and the quiet decisions that decide who eats when winter finally arrives.